The envelope felt heavy in my hands despite containing just a single sheet of paper. Thomas's divorce papers, served 3 months after he'd moved out of our home and into Melissa's downtown apartment. I traced my finger over the embossed letterhead of his attorney's firm while rain tapped against the windows of my home office. Our home, the one I'd paid for entirely. The bastard couldn't even deliver them himself, I whispered to the empty room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd known this was coming since the night he'd packed his designer suits and collection of luxury watches I'd gifted him over our 8 years of marriage. What I hadn't expected was the strange sense of relief washing over me as I signed the papers with my maiden name, Victoria Chen, a name I'd kept hidden from Thomas throughout our marriage. "All finished, Ms. Chen?" my attorney Diana asked as I slid the signed documents across the polished oak table. "Yes. And he's asking for alimony?" I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped my lips. "After leaving me for his 26-year-old secretary?" Diana's professional demeanor cracked slightly as she afforded me a smile. "His attorney claims you've been the primary breadwinner and that Mr. Reynolds became accustomed to a certain lifestyle during your marriage." "A lifestyle funded entirely by my consulting business," I reminded her, though we both knew this well. Thomas had no idea about my other income sources. "I assume the prenup will handle this swiftly?" "Absolutely. The infidelity clause is ironclad. Mr. Reynolds won't be entitled to anything beyond what he brought into the marriage," Diana confirmed, organizing the papers with practiced efficiency. "Which, according to our records, amounts to a 2015 Audi and approximately $78,000 in savings." I nodded, recalling how impressed I'd been by Thomas's apparent financial responsibility when we'd first met. It had taken 2 years of marriage to realize those savings were merely family money he'd been gifted, not the fruits of his own labor. And, "Meridian Technologies?" I asked, my voice deliberately casual. "He has no claim there, correct?" Diana's eyes flicked up to meet mine. "None whatsoever. Your ownership of Meridian and its subsidiaries was established years before your marriage and protected by multiple corporate veils and the prenuptial agreement. Mr. Reynolds has no knowledge of your connection to Meridian, as per your instructions." Perfect. The rain had stopped by the time I left Diana's office, the late afternoon sun breaking through gaps in the clouds as I slid into my deliberately modest Volvo. Not the car of a woman worth over $2 billion, but the perfect vehicle for Victoria Reynolds, independent marketing consultant with a comfortable but unexceptional income. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone vibrated against the leather seat. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. My right-hand woman, the only person at Meridian Technologies who knew both Victoria Reynolds, abandoned wife, and Victoria Chen, the reclusive, founder and majority shareholder of one of the country's fastest-growing tech companies. "Tell me," I answered, pulling into traffic. "The board approved your proposal," Sarah reported, her voice crisp with satisfaction. "The executive restructuring will begin next month. They've also greenlit the acquisition of Novatech." I allowed myself a small smile. "And how did our VP of Marketing take the news about the upcoming changes?" "Thomas?" Sarah's tone carried a hint of satisfaction. "He wasn't in the meeting. Apparently, he had a personal appointment this afternoon. Signing divorce papers, no doubt." "Was his assistant there in his place?" "Melissa? No. She called in sick today. How convenient." "Keep me updated on the acquisition timeline. I want everything in place before the restructuring announcement." I ended the call as I pulled into my neighborhood, understated luxury homes, nestled against the edge of the city's most prestigious district. Thomas had always complained about living here, constantly pushing for us to move to the glittering downtown high-rises where his colleagues lived, where Melissa lived now, with him. The house was quiet as I entered, just as it had been for the 3 months since Thomas left. But unlike those first few weeks filled with hollow silence and unexpected tears, tonight the emptiness felt purposeful. Clean. Like a canvas waiting for new strokes. I kicked off my heels and headed straight to my office, the only room in the house Thomas had never fully invaded. Behind the tasteful watercolor painting of San Francisco Bay, a gift from my father before he passed, was a small wall safe. Inside lay the other half of my life. Access keys to Meridian Technologies' secure servers, documents detailing my ownership through a complex network of holding companies, and a second phone used exclusively for communicating as Victoria Chen Dar. I retrieved this phone now, checking for messages. 3 new emails from the acquisition team, a text from Sarah with additional board meeting notes, and a calendar notification for tomorrow's quarterly performance review of the marketing department, Thomas's department, my department, really. Though no one at Meridian besides Sarah knew this. The story Thomas knew was simple. We met at a charity gala 8 years ago where I was working as an event coordinator. He was charming, successful, recently promoted to marketing manager at a tech company I pretended to know little about. I let him pursue me, impressed by his confidence and apparent ambition. When we married a year later, I told him I was starting my own marketing consultancy, a convenient explanation for my income and flexible schedule while allowing me to keep my true position a secret. The truth was far more complex. I'd founded Meridian Technologies 12 years ago after selling my first startup for enough millions to make most people retire young. But I'd watched my father's software company get chewed up and destroyed by corporate wolves, leaving him broken in his final years. His advice had stayed with me. The moment they know who you really are, they stop seeing you and start seeing $signs. So Victoria Chen became a phantom. A name on incorporation documents, a voice on rare conference calls, a figure deliberately shrouded in mystery. I operated through layers of holding companies, private equity firms, and trusted proxies like Sarah. To the business world, Victoria Chen was a reclusive genius who avoided publicity. To my employees, including my husband, I didn't exist at all. The arrangement had worked perfectly until I started noticing subtle changes in Thomas about a year ago. The late nights at the office, the missed dinners, the sudden business trips with vague itineraries. Then came the telltale signs of an affair: password-protected phones, unexplained charges, and that distinct cologne masking another perfume scent that clung to his shirts. I'd hired a private investigator, of course. The photographs of Thomas and his young secretary Melissa arrived in my encrypted email within a week. Dinner dates at restaurants across town. Entering her apartment building at night, leaving the next morning in the same clothes. A weekend trip to wine country when he'd told me he was at a marketing conference in Chicago. The betrayal stung, but not as deeply as I'd expected. Perhaps some part of me had already detached from Thomas, recognizing the ambition that had initially attracted me had calcified into entitlement and arrogance. What truly infuriated me wasn't losing him. It was that he thought he could discard me so easily while continuing to build his career at my company. My second phone chimed with a message from Sarah. Thomas just emailed HR about his divorce, requesting they update his marital status and emergency contact information. So efficient, so clinical. I wondered if he'd discarded his marriage vows with the same bureaucratic precision. Any reaction from the team? I texted back. Sympathy. Most don't know about Melissa yet, but they would soon. Office romances rarely stayed secret for long, especially when they involved a department VP and his much younger assistant. Spent the evening reviewing quarterly performance reports while sipping a glass of Barolo that cost more than what Thomas probably assumed I earned in a day. The marketing department numbers were concerning. Client acquisition had slowed. Campaign effectiveness metrics were down. Employee turnover had increased 23% since Thomas took over as VP 18 months ago. Thomas had been pushing an aggressive rebranding strategy that the board, meaning primarily me, working through my proxies, had consistently delayed. His ideas weren't terrible, but they lacked the innovative edge Meridian needed to stay ahead of competitors. He was playing it safe, recycling concepts that had worked at other companies rather than developing a unique vision. Yet, in board meetings, he presented himself as a marketing visionary, hamstrung by conservative leadership. The Thomas Reynolds who spoke in those meetings was a different man from the one who'd shared my home. More commanding, more arrogant, quick to take credit for successful initiatives while subtly shifting blame for failures. I closed the performance report and pulled up the organizational chart for Meridian's executive team. For years, I'd maintained my distance, working through Sarah and other trusted lieutenants, deliberately limiting my direct influence to major strategic decisions. It had kept the company healthy while protecting my privacy. But things were about to change. The Novatech acquisition would shake up the entire corporate structure. New divisions would need to be integrated, redundant positions eliminated, leadership reassessed. The perfect opportunity for Victoria Chen to step out of the shadows, at least partially. My phone rang again. Sarah. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "Thomas just sent an email to the executive team proposing an emergency meeting tomorrow before the board announcement. He's making a play for the COO position that will open up during restructuring." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. "Forward it to me." Thomas's email arrived seconds later. I had to admire his boldness, if nothing else. He'd outlined a comprehensive case for his promotion, emphasizing his strategic vision and proven leadership, while attaching a slick presentation about his plans for integrating Novatech's marketing assets into Meridian. What struck me most was his presumption that he knew about the acquisition and restructuring at all. The board had only approved it hours ago, and the announcement wasn't scheduled until tomorrow afternoon. Either he had a source on the board, or, more likely, he'd been monitoring communications he shouldn't have access to. "Sarah," I said when I called her back, "I think it's time for an IT security audit. Focus on executive email accounts and access logs. I want to know exactly what Thomas has been looking at and who might be feeding him information." "Already. On it," Sarah replied. "And the emergency meeting he's proposing?" I considered this for a moment. "Let it proceed. I'm curious to see what he's planning." "Will you attend remotely as Ms. Chen?" "No," I decided. "This time I want to see his performance up close. Schedule Victoria Reynolds for a marketing consultation with the executive team tomorrow. Same time." Sarah paused. "Are you sure that's wise?" "Not at all," I admitted. "But I'm tired of watching from a distance." After we hung up, I found myself standing before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, studying my reflection. At 42, I was still fit and youthful enough to turn heads, though fine lines had begun to frame my eyes and mouth. My long black hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail during my consulting work, fell loose around my shoulders now. Thomas had always said I should dress more fashionably, wear more makeup, present myself with the polish of the executive wives he admired. I'd deliberately maintained my understated look, both to reinforce my consultant persona and, I realized now, to avoid drawing too much attention in Meridian's offices during my occasional visits. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would begin the careful unraveling of Thomas Reynolds' carefully constructed career. I slept surprisingly well that night, waking before my alarm to the gentle ping of an email arriving on my secure phone. It was from our head of IT security, a preliminary report showing that Thomas had indeed been accessing confidential communications, using Melissa's credentials to view board meeting agendas and executive correspondence. So predictable. So careless. I dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored charcoal pantsuit that projected quiet competence rather than flashy status. Pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Low heels that wouldn't echo dramatically through Meridians. Sleek hallways. The goal wasn't to stand out, but to observe without being truly seen, at least for now. Meridian Technologies occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming tower downtown. As founder, I could have claimed the penthouse office with its panoramic city views, but that space belonged to Gregory Wells, the figurehead CEO who believed he ran the company while actually executing my vision through carefully structured guidance from the board. My consultant visits typically took me to the marketing department on the 37th floor, where I'd provided occasional outside perspective over the years. This arrangement had allowed me to monitor operations firsthand while maintaining my cover. Thomas had initially welcomed my input, even championed some of my suggestions to his team. That changed after his promotion to VP, when he began treating my visits as intrusions into his territory. The security guard at the lobby desk smiled in recognition as I signed in. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds. Haven't seen you in a while." "It's Ms. Chen now," I corrected him gently. "Or Victoria is fine." His eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear. I didn't know." "It's recent," I assured him, accepting the visitor badge he handed me. "Is the executive team already gathered in the Maple conference room?" "Yes, ma'am. Started about 10 minutes ago." He hesitated. "Mr. Reynolds is up there too." "I'm aware. Thank you, Paul." The elevator ride to the 40th floor gave me a few moments to center myself. I'd encountered Thomas at Meridian before, of course, but never with the knowledge that he was sleeping with his secretary. Never after he'd left me, never with divorce papers freshly signed. The familiar flutter of anxiety in my stomach wasn't fear, I realized. It was anticipation. The Maple conference room had glass walls that turned opaque with the touch of a button when privacy was needed. Today, they remained transparent, allowing me to observe the executive team as I approached. 8 people seated around a polished table, with Thomas standing at the front beside a large display screen showing marketing projections. He looked good, damn him. Freshly trimmed hair, new suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly, an easy confidence as he gestured toward the figures on screen. Only I could see the subtle tells of stress, the tightness around his eyes, the too frequent adjustment of his custom cufflinks, another gift from me. Sarah spotted me first, rising from her seat. "Victoria, thank you for joining us. We were just reviewing some marketing projections." All heads turned toward me. Thomas froze mid-sentence, his professional smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Victoria," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I wasn't aware you were consulting today." "Last-minute request," I replied, taking the empty seat beside Sarah. "Please, continue. Don't let me interrupt." Thomas hesitated, visibly recalibrating. We'd maintained a professional facade at Meridian since our separation, limited to brief, awkward encounters in hallways and cafeterias. This was our first time sharing a conference room since he'd left. "As I was saying," he continued, tearing his eyes away from me, "the Novatech acquisition represents a unique opportunity to reposition Meridian in the marketplace. Their client base complements ours perfectly, and their marketing assets could be integrated seamlessly under the right leadership." I watched him slip back into his presentation, outlining his vision for a consolidated marketing operation that would, conveniently, require an expanded role for him. The confidence in his voice made it sound like the acquisition was already common knowledge, though it wouldn't be announced publicly until that afternoon. "Ambitious plan," commented Gregory Wells, the CEO. "But perhaps premature?" "The acquisition hasn't been formally announced," Thomas smiled smoothly. "We all know it's happening, Greg. The board approved it yesterday. I'm simply getting ahead of the inevitable restructuring discussion." I caught Sarah's subtle glance in my direction. Thomas shouldn't have known about the board's approval. The information leak was even worse than we'd suspected. "And you believe you're the right person to lead this expanded marketing division?" asked Naomi Patel, our chief financial officer. "Not just marketing," Thomas replied. "I'm proposing a promotion to chief operating officer, overseeing marketing, sales, and the integration of Novatech's customer-facing teams." The audacity took my breath away. Thomas was essentially proposing to become the second most powerful executive at Meridian, with control over nearly half the company's operations. "That's quite a leap from marketing VP," observed Jeffrey Liu, our current COO, who was set to retire after the restructuring. Thomas's smile didn't waver. "Sometimes bold moves are necessary for companies to evolve. Meridian has played it safe for too long, especially with Victoria Chen's conservative oversight limiting our growth potential." I felt rather than saw Sarah stiffen beside me. Thomas had just openly criticized the founder, me, to make his case for promotion. "And what makes you think Ms. Chen is too conservative?" I asked, keeping my voice light, curious. Thomas turned toward me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the charm that had once captivated me. "No disrespect to our founder, but Meridian's market share has plateaued under her distant leadership. We need someone with boots on the ground making day-to-day decisions, not quarterly directives filtered through the board." "Interesting perspective," I murmured, making a show of jotting notes while my pulse quickened. "And you believe you could do better?" "I know I could," Thomas said with absolute conviction. "My team has consistently outperformed the targets set by the board. Imagine what we could accomplish with expanded authority." Gregory Wells looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Thomas, I appreciate your initiative, but this discussion seems premature. Why don't we table it until after the official announcement? Victoria, you were scheduled to provide some marketing consultation?" I smiled pleasantly. "Actually, I think Thomas's proposal deserves consideration." "His confidence is certainly compelling." Thomas looked surprised but pleased by my apparent support. "Perhaps," I continued, "we should review the marketing department's performance metrics before discussing expansion of responsibilities." Sarah smoothly pulled up the quarterly report I'd reviewed the previous night. The screen behind Thomas changed to display a dashboard of key performance indicators, most showing concerning downward trends. "These numbers tell a different story than your presentation, Thomas," I observed. "Client acquisition down, campaign effectiveness declining, department turnover increasing. Are you suggesting these results qualify you for promotion?" The confidence in Thomas's expression flickered. "Those metrics don't reflect the innovative approaches we've implemented. We're in a transition phase as we shift to more digital-first strategies." "A transition that's lasted 18 months?" I asked innocently. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. The other executives were watching our exchange with varying degrees of awkwardness and interest. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Thomas suggested, his eyes briefly flicking to the wedding ring I still wore, a deliberate choice for today's meeting. "I'm merely providing the marketing consultation I was asked to deliver," I replied coolly. "As an outside observer, I see a department whose performance has declined under its current leadership, while its head is preoccupied with personal matters and unauthorized access to confidential company information." The subtle bomb I'd dropped took a moment to detonate. Thomas's face drained of color as he realized the implication of my words. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Sarah touched her tablet, and the screen changed again, now showing access logs highlighting dozens of instances where Melissa Moore's security credentials had been used to view confidential board communications, all during times when her own computer was idle and Thomas's was active. This is a misunderstanding," Thomas stammered, looking around the table for support and finding none. "Melissa sometimes uses my computer when I'm dictating responses." "At 11:42 p.m. on a Sunday?" Sarah asked, highlighting one particularly. Damning log entry. I watched Thomas's careful facade begin to crumble as he realized he was being exposed, not just for the security breach, but for the affair as well. The timing of the access logs made it obvious he'd been with Melissa outside of office hours. "I think," said Gregory Wells heavily, "we should adjourn this meeting. Thomas, please report to HR immediately. The rest of you, We'll reconvene after the company-wide announcement this afternoon. The executives filed out silently, leaving only Thomas, Sarah, and me in the conference room. Thomas stood frozen by the display screen, his proposal for promotion now replaced by evidence of his misconduct. "You set me up," he said finally, looking directly at me. "You knew about the logs before this meeting?" "Yes," I acknowledged simply. "Is this because of us? Because of the divorce?" His voice held a note of desperate appeal. "Victoria, our personal lives shouldn't affect professional decisions." I nearly laughed at his hypocrisy. Interesting perspective from a man sleeping with his secretary. "That's not fair," he protested. "Melissa and I used her login credentials to access confidential company information," I finished for him. "That's not a personal matter, Thomas. That's corporate espionage." Sarah stood. "I'll escort you to HR, Thomas. They're expecting you." As they moved toward the door, Thomas paused beside my chair, lowering his voice. "This isn't over, Victoria. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. I'm too valuable to this company for them to lose over a minor security protocol breach." I looked up at him, allowing myself a small smile. "We'll see." After they left, I remained in the conference room, gazing out at the cityscape beyond the glass walls. Thomas was right about one thing. This wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "HR meeting underway. Board requests your presence for emergency session at 2 p.m. I checked my watch. 3 hours until the board meeting. Time enough to prepare for the next phase. As I gathered my things, I noticed Thomas had left his presentation materials behind in his haste to follow Sarah to HR. I flipped through them, noting how he'd positioned himself as the indispensable future of Meridian Technologies. The last slide contained his proposed organizational chart with his name at the top, just below the CEO. The arrogance was breathtaking. He truly believed he was untouchable, valuable enough to survive both our divorce and his security breaches. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the board would view his actions as a minor infraction, a momentary lapse in judgment from an otherwise valuable executive. Unless, of course, Victoria Chen herself made a rare appearance to weigh in on the matter. Pulled out my secure phone and composed a message to the board secretary. "Please inform the directors that I will attend today's emergency session in person. First time in 5 years, I know. Tell them it's time they met the woman behind the name, V. Chen." I could almost imagine their reactions. Most of the board members had never seen me, dealing instead with my attorneys and representatives. A few of the longest-serving directors had met me years ago when Meridian was in its infancy. None of them knew about my marriage to Thomas or my occasional presence in the company as a marketing consultant. That careful separation of identities had served me well for years. Now, it would serve a different purpose. I left the conference room and headed for the executive floor's private restroom. From my bag, I retrieved a small cosmetics case and began the subtle transformation from Victoria Reynolds, modest consultant, to Victoria Chen, billionaire founder. The changes were minor but effective. Hair swept up into a sleek chignon. Higher heels that had been stowed in my bag. A touch more, makeup. Diamond earrings in place of pearls. The same charcoal suit, but now accessorized with a striking emerald pendant that had remained hidden beneath my blouse until now. It wasn't a disguise being removed so much as a deliberate dimming being reversed. The woman who emerged from the restroom commanded attention in a way Victoria Reynolds never had. I sent Sarah a brief text. "Bringing Victoria Chen to the board meeting. Prepare the directors." Her reply came instantly. "Are you sure?" No, I wasn't sure. This would change everything. Once I revealed myself to the board as both Victoria Chen and Thomas's soon-to-be ex-wife, there would be no going back to comfortable anonymity. The story would eventually leak. Questions would be asked about why the founder of a multi-billion-dollar technology company had been masquerading as a mid-level consultant, while her husband climbed the corporate ladder without knowing. who he was really married to. It would be messy, complicated, and potentially damaging to Meridian's reputation in the short term. But watching Thomas's face when he realized who he had really been married to, who he had cheated on, lied to, and tried to extract alimony from, would be worth it. I'm sure, I texted back. Meet me in your office in 1 hour to prepare. I slipped my phone back into my bag and headed for the elevator. I had just enough time to retrieve something from the safety deposit box at my bank, something I'd kept secure for 12 years, something that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind about who really controlled Meridian Technologies. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal surface and hardly recognized myself. But that was the point, wasn't it? After years of hiding in plain sight, Victoria Chen was finally ready to step into the light, and Thomas Reynolds was about to discover just how badly he had underestimated his wife. The safety deposit box contained just 3 items: the original, Meridian Technologies Incorporation documents with my signature and thumbprint, the handwritten business plan I'd created 12 years ago in my father's hospital room as he fought his final battle with cancer, and a small velvet pouch containing my father's signet ring, the one possession he'd kept after losing everything to corporate raiders. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it sat heavy and slightly loose. The documents went into my leather portfolio. Even in a digital age, original paperwork still carried undeniable weight. Ms. Chen? The bank manager hovered nervously nearby. Is there anything else you need today? It took me a moment to realize he was addressing me directly. Few people at this branch knew Victoria Chen's face, but all of them recognized the name on the high-security box that required special clearance to access. No, thank you, Raymond. That will be all. As my town car pulled away from the bank, my secure phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Thomas still in HR meeting, lawyers now present. Good. Let him sweat. My driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Back to Meridian Technologies, Ms. Chen? Yes, but use the private entrance. The building's secure executive garage had a direct elevator to the boardroom floor, an access point I'd used perhaps 3 times in Meridian's history, and never during normal business hours. I spent the drive reviewing my notes for the board meeting, mentally preparing for questions that would inevitably arise when I unveiled my dual identity. How had I maintained the deception for years? Why had I chosen to reveal myself now? What did this mean for the company's leadership structure? The answers were complicated, but the timing was perfect. The Novatech acquisition would reshape Meridian's organizational chart regardless. Adding the revelation of the founder's identity to the mix would create temporary chaos but ultimately strengthen my control. The parking garage was cool and dim as we pulled in, the private bay empty except for a security guard who straightened to attention when he recognized the car. Ms. Chen, he greeted me as I stepped out. It's an honor. The board is gathering upstairs. I nodded my acknowledgement and moved toward the private elevator, my heels clicking precisely against the concrete. The guard swiped his security card and stepped back as the doors slid open. They don't know I'm coming, I told him, a small smile playing at my lips. He matched my expression. Should be interesting then. The elevator required a biometric scan, retina, and fingerprint before beginning its smooth ascent to the executive floor. I used the brief journey to center myself, watching the floor numbers climb steadily upward. The woman reflected in the mirrored walls looked nothing like the Victoria Reynolds who had entered the building earlier that day. This woman carried herself with unmistakable authority, her expression composed but determined. Sarah was waiting when the elevator doors opened, on the 43rd floor. They're all here, she murmured, falling into step beside me. Including Thomas. I raised an eyebrow. He was invited to the board meeting? He insisted, claiming he needed to defend himself against baseless accusations. Sarah's disapproval was evident. Gregory wasn't strong enough to refuse him. Typical Gregory, competent at executing my vision but conflict-averse to a fault. It was why I'd chosen him as CEO. He made an excellent administrator, but lacked the force of personality to ever truly seize control. Actually, this is perfect, I decided. I'd rather not repeat this performance. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, heavy wood panels carved with Meridian's distinctive logo, my design, inspired by my father's original software company emblem. Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. Ready? I nodded once, decisive. Let's rewrite the narrative. The conversation inside died instantly as we entered. 12 people seated around the massive boardroom table turned toward us simultaneously, expressions morphing from irritation to confusion to shock as they registered my presence. At the far end of the table, Thomas half rose from his seat, his face broadcasting utter bewilderment as he tried to reconcile the sight of his estranged wife transformed into someone both familiar and strange. Victoria? His voice cracked slightly. What are you doing here? I ignored him, focusing instead on the assembled board members, most of whom were staring with varying degrees of recognition dawning on their faces. Good afternoon, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly through the silence. For those who don't know me or who haven't seen me in some years, I'm Victoria Chen. Ms. Chen, Gregory stammered, rising awkwardly. We weren't expecting you in person. Clearly. I moved to the empty chair at the head of the table, my chair, though I'd never physically occupied it. Please, everyone, remain seated. We have much to discuss. Thomas was still standing, his expression cycling rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and the beginnings of comprehension. Victoria, what is this? He demanded. Why are you pretending to be Victoria Chen? I met his gaze directly for the first time. I'm not pretending, Thomas. I am Victoria Chen, founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Technologies. I have been since before we met. The blood drained from his face so rapidly, I momentarily worried he might faint. He sank back into his chair, gripping the armrests. That's impossible, he whispered. I would have known. Would you? I asked mildly, opening my portfolio and removing the incorporation documents. You never questioned why a marketing consultant could afford a $3 million home. You never wondered why I had such flexible hours, or why clients you never met paid so generously for my services. I passed the documents to Gregory, who examined them with wide eyes before passing them around the table. But Thomas trailed off, visibly struggling to reconcile his reality with this new information. Your wife? I supplied. Soon, to be ex-wife, as you've made abundantly clear. The woman you left for your 26-year-old secretary 3 months ago, the woman you're attempting to extract alimony from despite the prenuptial agreement you signed. I paused, letting my words sink in. The woman who actually owns the company you've been trying to climb to the top of. The board members exchanged glances, the uncomfortable realization of what they were witnessing spreading around the table. This wasn't just a corporate revelation. It was a marital drama playing out in Meridian's highest chamber. This is inappropriate, Thomas said finally, attempting to regain some control. My personal life has nothing to do with company business. On that limited point, we agree, I replied, nodding to Sarah, who distributed folders to each board member. Which is why we should focus on your professional misconduct rather than your infidelity. The folders contained detailed reports of Thomas's security breaches, complete with timestamps, access logs, and forensic evidence showing the systematic pattern of his espionage. These records demonstrate that Thomas Reynolds has repeatedly used his assistant Melissa Moore's credentials to access confidential board communications and documents he was not authorized to view, I explained as the directors flipped through the damning evidence. This includes acquisition strategies, restructuring plans, and confidential personnel files. I was gathering information to better position the marketing department, Thomas protested, his composure cracking. It was for the good of the company. Was it for the good of the company when you accessed my personal file? Demanded Naomi Patel, our CFO. My compensation details and performance reviews? Thomas flinched. I was researching executive salary structures for my proposal. By committing multiple violations of our security protocols and potentially breaking federal law, I noted, the question before the board is simple. What action should be taken in response to these violations? Gregory cleared his throat. Given the severity of the breaches, termination seems appropriate, along with a full investigation to determine if any information was shared with outside parties. I agree, said Jonathan Wright, our longest-serving board member. We can't allow such flagrant disregard for confidentiality, regardless of the unusual personal circumstances. Thomas looked desperately around the table, searching for allies and finding none. Even directors who had once supported his initiatives were now avoiding his gaze, unwilling to be associated with his misconduct. This is all an elaborate setup, he said finally, focusing on me. Victoria is orchestrating this because I left her. She's using her position to exact revenge. A few years ago, such an accusation might have caused the directors to hesitate. But I'd been preparing for this moment, building my reputation with the board through consistent, successful strategy and impeccable integrity. Thomas, meanwhile, had cultivated an image of ambition that, in retrospect, now looked like naked opportunism. Mr. Reynolds, said Eliza Kaufman, the newest and youngest director, the logs show you accessed confidential information at 11:42 p.m. on a Sunday from Ms. Moore's account. Are you denying that occurred? Thomas's jaw worked as he sought a credible defense. I may have occasionally used Melissa's login when mine wasn't working properly. 67 times in the past 3 months? Eliza asked, consulting the report. And always to access information above your clearance level, added Jonathan. I watched Thomas's desperate flailing with a detached fascination. The man I'd married had always presented himself as supremely confident, in control, the smartest person in any room. That facade was crumbling before my eyes, revealing something much smaller and more pathetic beneath. Perhaps, I suggested, reclaiming the room's attention, we should vote on the appropriate action. As a procedural note, while I hold majority shares, I will abstain from this vote to avoid any suggestion of personal bias. Thomas seized on this concession. At least she acknowledges her conflict of interest. This entire situation is inappropriate. I should be judged on my contributions to Meridian, not on my personal relationship with... He faltered, apparently, unable to decide how to refer to me now. Your contributions are precisely what we're evaluating, I reminded him. Your marketing department's performance metrics have declined steadily under your leadership, while you've been focusing on unauthorized access to confidential information and your extramarital affair with your assistant. That's unfair, Thomas snapped, color rising in his face. The marketing department has been implementing innovative strategies that take time to show results, and my relationship with Melissa began after our marriage was effectively over. I raised an eyebrow. Is that what you told her? Because according to the private investigator I hired, your affair began approximately 10 months ago. Well before you claimed our marriage was effectively over. The room fell awkwardly silent. I hadn't intended to venture so explicitly into our personal history, but Thomas's attempt to rewrite our marital timeline had triggered something raw and honest within me. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Thomas said, gesturing frantically. She hired a private investigator to follow me. She's been planning this ambush for months. This isn't about security protocols. It's about a vengeful, soon-to-be ex-wife using her position to destroy me professionally. That's enough, Thomas, Gregory interrupted, his face flushed with discomfort. The evidence of policy violations stands on its own, regardless of how it came to light. I folded my hands on the table. I suggest we proceed with the vote. The motion is to terminate Thomas Reynolds' employment with Meridian Technologies, effective immediately. due to documented security violations and accessing confidential company information without authorization. Second, said Naomi Patel instantly. Gregory nodded. All in favor? Hands rose around the table, some quickly, others with reluctance, but all eventually raising. The vote was unanimous. The motion carries, Gregory announced. Mr. Reynolds, your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, after which you will surrender your access credentials and leave the premises. Thomas sat frozen, staring at me with a mixture of shock, humiliation, and dawning horror as the full implications sank in. Not only had he lost his marriage by cheating with his young secretary, but he'd now lost his career at the company he'd thought would be his stepping stone to fortune. And worst of all, he'd discovered that the wife he'd discarded so carelessly was actually the power behind the throne he'd been so desperate to claim. You can't do this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've given 8 years to this company, and the company has given you generous compensation, career advancement, and multiple opportunities to succeed, I replied evenly. It also gave you the benefit of the doubt far longer than was warranted. That ends today. I nodded to Sarah, who opened the boardroom door. 2 security officers stood waiting outside. Please go with security, Thomas, I said quietly. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. For a moment, I thought he might resist, might create the kind of scene that would require forcible removal. But Thomas had always been concerned with appearances, with maintaining the facade of control even when it was slipping away. He stood slowly, straightening his tie in a reflexive gesture. This isn't over, he said, looking directly at me. You've made a serious mistake. I met his gaze steadily. No, Thomas, the mistake was yours, several times over. He stalked from the room, flanked by security, his back rigid with humiliation and barely suppressed rage. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the boardroom shifted. The directors exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed after witnessing such a personal and professional implosion. Well, said Gregory finally, that was unprecedented. Yes, I agreed, and I owe you all an explanation. Not just about Thomas, but about why I've maintained my privacy for so long and why I've chosen to reveal myself now. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined my history with Meridian, the full version, not the sanitized corporate biography that existed in press releases and financial filings. I explained how I'd watched my father's company fall to predatory, corporate maneuvering, how I'd vowed to build something lasting but protected, how I'd deliberately separated my personal and professional identities. When I met Thomas 8 years ago, I was already practicing this compartmentalization, I explained. It seemed simpler to maintain that separation than to reveal my true position and wonder if his interest was genuine or motivated by my wealth and status. So, he never knew? Eliza asked, fascination evident in her expression. In 8 years of marriage? No, I confirmed. Though in retrospect, perhaps that says more about his self-absorption than my discretion. He never questioned the inconsistencies. In my consulting career, never wondered why we could afford our lifestyle on what he believed was my modest income combined with his Meridian salary. And now? Jonathan asked. Moving forward, how does this affect Meridian's leadership structure? That brings us to the second item on today's agenda, I replied, shifting focus to the business at hand. The Novatech acquisition and subsequent restructuring. For the remainder of the meeting, we discussed the integration plans, the new organizational chart, and the public messaging around the acquisition. I confirmed that I would be stepping into a more visible role as executive chairwoman, with Gregory remaining as CEO, but reporting directly to me rather than the board. We'll announce the acquisition and restructuring at tomorrow's all-hands meeting, I concluded, along with my formal introduction to the company. I expect there will be considerable surprise and some discomfort as employees adjust to learning my dual identity. Particularly in the marketing department, Naomi observed wryly. Yes. Which reminds me, Sarah, please arrange for Melissa Moore to be placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her potential involvement in the security breaches. Already done, Sarah confirmed. Security is escorting her out now. I checked my watch. The board meeting had run longer than anticipated, but we'd accomplished everything necessary. If there's nothing else, I suggest we adjourn until tomorrow's announcement. As the directors filed out, several paused to welcome me personally or express support for my decision to step forward. Jonathan, who had known me longest, lingered until we were alone. I always wondered when this day would come, he said. His weathered face creased with a knowing smile. Though I admit, I never imagined it would unfold quite so dramatically. Neither, did I admitted. But then, I never imagined Thomas would be quite so foolish either. Jonathan's expression sobered. He won't go quietly, Victoria. Men like Thomas rarely do, especially when their pride is wounded. And his has been wounded, catastrophically today. I know, I sighed, but I've prepared for that too. After Jonathan left, I remained in the boardroom, gazing out at the city skyline as dusk gathered. From this height, the city looked orderly, structured, each building and street part of a coherent whole. But I knew the chaos that existed at street level, the constant jostling for position, the hidden agendas, the personal dramas playing out behind corporate facades. Sarah returned, tablet in hand. Thomas has left the building, she reported. Made quite a scene in the marketing department, telling everyone he was being railroaded by vengeful leadership. Security had to physically escort him to the elevator. I nodded, unsurprised. And Melissa? Tearful, confused. Claims she had no idea Thomas was using her credentials. Could be genuine. The logs show he accessed her account remotely most of the time, not from her workstation. Have HR offer her the option to resign rather than be terminated, I decided. If she cooperates with the investigation, and there's no evidence she knowingly participated, we can provide a modest severance. Sarah made a note, then hesitated. Thomas threatened legal action, said he'd sue for wrongful termination, defamation, and she paused, checking her notes. Alienation of corporate opportunity, whatever that means. I almost smiled at the emptiness of the threat. Let him try. Our legal team has already documented everything. Besides, his employment contract contained explicit confidentiality provisions with clear consequences for violations. My secure phone buzzed. A message from Diana, my divorce attorney. Thomas's lawyer requesting emergency conference call. Says circumstances have materially changed. Of course they had. Thomas had just discovered his soon-to-be ex-wife wasn't the financially dependent marketing consultant he could bully into an advantageous divorce settlement. She was Victoria Chen, billionaire founder of Meridian Technologies, the company that had just fired him for cause. Send the files to Diana, I instructed Sarah. All of them. The security breach evidence, the termination documentation, everything. Thomas is about to discover that his legal position has weakened considerably in both the personal and professional arenas. Sarah nodded, already typing instructions to our legal team. What about you? Where will you go now? I considered this, for a moment. I couldn't return to the home Thomas and I had shared, not tonight, when he might be desperate or angry enough to confront me there. Book me the penthouse suite at the Archer, I decided, and have security do a sweep of my house tomorrow. Change the locks, update the alarm codes, the usual precautions. Already arranged, Sarah confirmed with a small smile. Your overnight bag will be waiting at the Archer. I took the liberty of having your assistant pack some things when it became clear how today would unfold. I felt a rush of gratitude for her foresight. What would I do without you? Let's hope you never have to find out, she replied. Cars, waiting in the executive garage whenever you're ready. After Sarah left, I took a final moment alone in the boardroom, absently turning my father's signet ring on my finger. The day's events had unfolded largely according to plan, but the personal cost had been higher than I'd anticipated. Seeing Thomas's face as he realized the truth, watching the man I'd once loved crumble under the weight of his own betrayal and ambition, had brought less satisfaction than I'd expected. There was no triumph in witnessing someone's self-destruction, even when they'd earned it through their own actions. Only a hollow acknowledgement that some wounds never truly heal. They just become incorporated into who we are. I gathered my things and headed for the private elevator, leaving Victoria Reynolds behind for good. From now on, there would be only Victoria Chen, visible, undisguised, stepping fully into the light to claim what had always been mine. The elevator doors closed silently behind me, and I descended toward whatever came next. The Archer Hotel's penthouse suite offered panoramic views of the city I'd helped shape through Meridian's technological innovations. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of single malt in hand, watching lights blink on across the skyline as darkness fell. My phone had been buzzing steadily for the past hour, calls from board members checking in, messages from Diana updating me on Thomas's increasingly desperate legal maneuvers, emails from executives seeking clarity on tomorrow's announcement. I'd responded to the most urgent communications and silenced the rest. Tonight, I needed clarity rather than conversation, perspective rather than reaction. A soft knock at the suite door broke my reverie. Security had been instructed to allow no visitors, so I was unsurprised to find Sarah when I opened the door, still in her work clothes but with her usual tablet replaced by a leather portfolio. "I thought you might want these," she said, handing me the folder as she entered. "Preliminary press briefings for tomorrow, personnel updates from HR, and the latest from legal on Thomas's activities." "He's been busy," I observed, scanning the legal memo. "Called 3 different law firms specializing in employment litigation, contacted 2 reporters from the business press, and attempted to access his Meridian email account 4 times since, leaving the building." "Predictable," Sarah noted, settling into an armchair. "He's panicking, looking for leverage, trying to control the narrative." I set the papers aside and rejoined her, taking the adjacent seat. "Did I make a mistake, Sarah? Not telling him from the beginning who I really was?" She considered this carefully. Would it have changed anything? Would he have been a different person if he'd known he was married to a billionaire rather than a marketing consultant? Probably worse, I admitted. More entitled, more presumptuous. He likely would have tried to insert himself into Meridian's leadership even earlier. Exactly. You didn't create Thomas's character flaws by maintaining your privacy. You just delayed having to confront them in the professional sphere. Until now, I sighed. When it's all collapsed at once. Sarah leaned forward, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "Victoria, you've spent years building something extraordinary, while protecting yourself from people who would use you for their own advancement. Thomas made his choices, to break your trust, to betray your marriage, to violate company security protocols. Today's consequences were earned entirely by him." I nodded, taking comfort in her certainty even as my own wavered. "And tomorrow? Once everyone at Meridian knows?" "Tomorrow will be uncomfortable," she acknowledged, "but necessary. The company needs to see its founder step forward, especially now, during this transition. And you need to reclaim your complete identity, not just pieces of it." She was right. Of course. The compartmentalization that had once felt protective now seemed like an unnecessary constraint, a relic of old fears that no longer served me. "What about you?" I asked. "Your role changes after tomorrow, too. No longer the secret intermediary between the phantom founder and the company." Sarah smiled. "I've been preparing for this day as long as you have. I'm ready for whatever comes next." After she left, I returned to the window, city lights now fully ablaze against the night sky. Somewhere out there, Thomas was plotting his next move, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his career and marriage. I felt a distant pity for him, mixed with lingering anger, and a new, unexpected sense of liberation. Tomorrow would bring chaos and questions, recalibrations and revelations. But for the first time in years, I would face it as my complete self. No more shadows, no more divided identity. Victoria Chen was stepping fully into the light, ready to claim everything that had always been hers, including the company her soon-to-be ex-husband was about to beg to keep his job at. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched my resolve. I'd slept surprisingly well in the hotel's luxurious suite, free from the echoing emptiness of the home Thomas and I had shared. My personal assistant, Lynn, arrived at precisely 7 a.m. with a garment bag containing the outfit we'd selected for today's company-wide announcement. A tailored sapphire suit that projected authority without ostentation. "The car will be ready at 8:30, Lynn informed me, setting down a tray with fresh coffee. "Sarah reports all systems are in place for the announcement. Executive team briefing at 9:15, company-wide at 10. "And security?" I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Full coverage at all entry points. Thomas's access credentials have been completely deactivated, and the executive security team has been briefed with his photo." I nodded, satisfied with the preparations. "Any contact attempts overnight?" Lynn checked her tablet. 3 emails to your Victoria Reynolds account, all from Thomas, increasingly urgent in tone. The last one, sent at 3:17 a.m., demands a face-to-face meeting before today's announcement. "Content?" She hesitated fractionally. "Mostly attempts at manipulation, claims you're making a terrible mistake, that you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. The final email becomes more threatening, says he knows things about Meridian that could damage the company's reputation if made public." I almost smiled at the predictability of his tactics. Thomas had always resorted to veiled threats when backed into a corner, though they rarely had substance. "Forward the emails to legal and security. If he's threatening to disclose confidential information, that's another violation of his employment agreement." "Already done," Lynn confirmed. Also, Ms. Moore, the secretary, attempted to access the building at 6:30 this morning. Security denied entry per protocol. That was interesting. Did she say why she was there? To retrieve personal items, supposedly. Security offered to have HR collect and deliver anything she needed, but she declined and left without incident. Filed this information away, suspecting Melissa's early morning visit might have been prompted by Thomas. Had he sent her to retrieve something incriminating from his office? Or was she acting independently, trying to salvage what she could from the wreckage of her own career? Increase monitoring on both their communications, I decided. If they're coordinating, I want to know. Lynn made a note. Diana called. Thomas's attorney requested a delay in divorce proceedings pending reassessment of marital assets. Diana denied the request and informed them that your status as Meridian's founder has no bearing on the prenuptial agreement. Good. Anything else? The Novatech CEO confirmed her attendance at today's announcement. The acquisition press package is ready for distribution immediately following the internal announcement. I finished my coffee and moved toward the bathroom to prepare for the day ahead. Have a car sent for my mother, I added. She should be at the announcement. Lynn looked surprised. You're bringing Mrs. Chen into this. It's time, I replied. Simply. No more hiding, no more compartmentalization. That includes family. As Lynn departed to make the arrangements, I stood under the shower's steaming spray, mentally rehearsing the day ahead. The executive briefing would be straightforward. Most were already aware of my dual identity after yesterday's board meeting. The company-wide announcement would be more challenging, particularly for employees who had worked closely with me as Victoria Reynolds without ever knowing my true role. By 8:30, I was dressed, briefed, and ready. The sapphire suit was perfectly tailored, projecting confidence and authority. My father's signet ring gleamed on my right hand, a tangible connection to the legacy that had inspired Meridian's creation. The town car glided through morning traffic, my thoughts turning to Thomas. After his spectacular fall yesterday, he would be scrambling to salvage something, his reputation, leverage for the divorce, perhaps a revenge narrative he could sell to sympathetic ears. I'd anticipated various counter-moves he might attempt, from legal challenges to media leaks, but I couldn't predict which direction his desperation might take him. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. T's attorney requesting emergency meeting before Cobb today. Says he has proposal that benefits all parties. I texted back, deny request, all communication in writing only. Diana's response came quickly. Done. He's getting desperate. Good. Let him flail against the consequences of his own actions. The car pulled into Meridian's executive garage, where Sarah was waiting beside the private elevator. Her expression was professionally neutral, but I detected tension in her posture. What happened? I asked as the elevator doors closed behind us. Thomas is here, she replied, her voice tight. Somehow got past the lobby security checkpoint. He's in the main reception area, causing a scene. I felt a flash of irritation. Of course, Thomas would try something theatrical. He'd always believed in creating leverage through public confrontation. How? I demanded. His access was revoked. Used someone else's credential card. Security is reviewing footage now to identify who. The elevator continued its ascent toward the executive floor, but I made a quick decision. Take me to the main reception floor instead. Sarah's eyes widened. Are you sure that's wise? Security can remove him without your involvement. And create an even bigger spectacle? No. Better to contain this quickly, on my terms. She nodded reluctantly and redirected the elevator to the 30th floor, Meridian's grand reception area where visitors were received. As the elevator descended, I mentally adjusted my approach. I'd anticipated confronting Thomas eventually, but not in front of an audience of employees before the official announcement. Brief me, I instructed Sarah. He arrived approximately 15 minutes ago, demanding to see you, both as Victoria Reynolds and Victoria Chen. When reception staff informed him he no longer had building access, he became belligerent. Started telling anyone who would listen that you orchestrated his termination out of personal vengeance. Security was called, but hasn't removed him yet. They're waiting for instructions on how to handle it with minimum disruption. The elevator. Doors opened, and immediately I could hear Thomas's raised voice carrying across the reception area. A small crowd of employees had gathered at a safe distance, watching the confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. Trying to contact my wife since yesterday, Thomas was saying loudly to the security supervisor. I know she's in the building. This is a personal matter that needs to be resolved before she makes a serious mistake. Sir, as I've explained, you're no longer authorized to be on these premises, the security supervisor responded, maintaining remarkable calm. I need to ask you to leave voluntarily, or we will escort you out. Thomas caught sight of me then, his expression shifting from belligerence to something more complex. Relief mingled with anger and a calculated attempt at concern. Victoria, he called, stepping around the security officer to approach me. Finally, we need to talk before this goes any further. I remained where I was, conscious of the watching employees, many of whom still didn't know my true identity. This wasn't how I'd planned to reveal myself, but Thomas had forced my hand. Thomas, I replied, my voice deliberately measured, carrying across the now silent reception area. You're trespassing on Meridian property after being terminated for cause. That's a poor negotiating position to begin from. He moved closer, lowering his voice though still audible to those nearby. This isn't about negotiation. It's about stopping you from making a catastrophic error in judgment. You're about to throw away everything we've built because you're angry about our marriage. Everything we've built? I repeated, allowing a note of incredulity to enter my tone. Thomas, you've been at Meridian for 8 years. I founded this company 12 years ago. The ripple of confused murmurs spread through the watching employees. Thomas sensed the shifting atmosphere and changed tactics. Look, I understand you're hurt, he said. his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But claiming to be Victoria Chen? This elaborate revenge fantasy has gone too far. You need help, Victoria. Ah, so that was his strategy. Suggest I was having some kind of mental break, inventing a grandiose identity out of emotional distress. It might have been clever if the board meeting hadn't already happened, if my identity hadn't already been confirmed at the highest levels of the company. Security, I said calmly. Please escort Mr. Reynolds to the conference room on this floor. I'll speak with him there briefly, before he leaves the premises. Thomas smiled, mistaking my willingness to talk for weakness or uncertainty. He followed, the security officers without further protest, casting a triumphant glance at the gathered employees as if he'd somehow won this round. I turned to Sarah. Have Gregory delay the executive briefing by 30 minutes, and find out who helped Thomas. Access the building. I want them identified before I return. She nodded and moved away, already typing on her tablet. I took a moment to address the employees still standing in stunned silence. I apologize for this disruption, I said simply. There will be a company-wide announcement at 10 a.m. that will clarify much of what you just witnessed. Until then, I ask for your discretion and patience. Without waiting for their reaction, I followed the path Thomas had taken toward the conference room. It was time to end this particular drama once and for all. Thomas was seated at the conference table when I entered, security officers positioned discreetly by the door. He looked up with an expression of concerned reasonableness that I'd seen many times during our marriage, usually when he was attempting to manage a situation spinning beyond his control. Officers, wait outside, please, I instructed. When they hesitated, I added, leave the door open if you're concerned, but give us some privacy. Once they had stepped outside, Thomas leaned forward. Victoria, we need to talk reasonably about what's happening. This vendetta isn't good for either of us, and certainly not for Meridian. Vendetta, I repeated flatly. Is that what you call enforcing company security protocols after discovering your systematic violations? You know that's not what this is about, he insisted. You're angry that I left, and you're using your position as a consultant to influence the board against me. It's unprofessional and ultimately self-defeating. I studied him for a moment, genuinely curious about his strategy. Thomas, do you actually believe what you're saying? Or is this performance for whoever might be listening? He looked injured. I'm trying to help you. This fantasy you've constructed about being Victoria Chen. Stop, I interrupted, my patience evaporating. The board met yesterday. They've seen the incorporation documents. They've verified my identity. Your desperate attempt to paint me as delusional is both pathetic and futile. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. You can't be her, he said, but his conviction was weakening. I would have known. Would you? I asked, pulling out my phone and opening a secure folder. Let me help you accept reality. I placed the phone on the table between us, showing a series of photographs. Me at the original Meridian office 12 years ago, receiving an industry award under the name Victoria Chen, shaking hands with the governor at a tech summit, signing the original Novatech partnership agreement 5 years earlier. Thomas stared at the images, color draining from his face as the evidence mounted. This can't be, but it is, I said simply. I founded Meridian Technologies before I met you. I maintained my privacy for personal and professional reasons. And yes, when we met, I chose not to reveal my full identity. A decision that proved prescient given your character as it's emerged over time. Why? He managed finally, looking up from the photos with genuine bewilderment. Why live a double life? Why marry me without telling me who you really were? Initially, protection, I replied honestly. My father lost everything to people who saw him as a wallet rather than a person. I wanted to build something without being targeted for my wealth or position. And later? He pressed. After we were married? I considered the question carefully. Habit, partly, but also observation. I watched how you spoke about wealthy women, Thomas. The thinly veiled contempt, the assumptions about how they'd acquired their status. Why would I reveal myself to someone who clearly believed women in power had somehow cheated to get there? He flinched at the accuracy of the assessment. That's not fair. I respected your work. When it suited you? I interrupted. Until you decided your 26-year-old secretary was a better option. Until you decided to demand alimony from a wife you believed couldn't financially defend herself. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed, but only briefly. His expression hardened as he searched for a new angle of attack. So this is revenge, he concluded, for leaving you. No, Thomas. This is consequences. For violating company security protocols. For accessing confidential information without authorization. For planning to use that information to advance your career at the expense of the company's strategic interests. We have the logs, I reminded him. Every unauthorized access, every file you viewed, every confidential communication you shouldn't have seen. The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable. He stared at me for a long moment, calculation, visible behind his eyes. Then his shoulders slumped slightly as he shifted strategy again. I made a mistake, he admitted, his voice softening. Several mistakes. I never should have accessed those files, and I never should have left our marriage, the way I did. But Victoria, 8 years together has to count for something. We built a life. Stop, I said firmly. This isn't a negotiation about our marriage. That ended when you packed your things and moved in with Melissa. This is about your professional misconduct and its consequences. I'm asking for another chance, he persisted. People make mistakes. Companies forgive executives all the time for judgment lapses. I know Meridian's systems, its culture. I've helped build the marketing department into what it is today. Department with declining performance metrics and increasing staff turnover, I noted. The data doesn't support your value proposition, Thomas. His facade of contrition cracked slightly. You can't just erase 8 years of my career because you're angry about our divorce. I'm not erasing anything. Your employment record will accurately reflect your contributions and your termination for cause due to security violations. What happens next is entirely up to you. Meaning? Meaning you can leave quietly, with dignity, intact, and move on to the next phase of your career elsewhere. Or you can continue this futile campaign, threatening legal action you can't sustain, making accusations that will only damage your professional reputation further. Thomas leaned back, studying me with new eyes, not as his soon-to-be ex-wife, but as the powerful executive I'd always been. And Melissa? He asked finally. Ms. Moore's situation will be determined by the investigation. If she knowingly participated in your security breaches, she'll be terminated. If not, she'll be offered the opportunity to resign with a modest severance. He nodded slowly, processing this information. And our divorce? Proceeds as filed, according to the terms of our prenuptial agreement. Your recent discovery about my financial status has no bearing on its validity. A flash of the old Thomas, calculating, opportunistic, surfaced briefly. Some might argue that withholding material information about your wealth constitutes fraud. Your attorney is welcome to make that argument, I replied, unperturbed. My attorneys will counter with evidence of your infidelity, which triggers the clause voiding any claims beyond what you brought into the marriage. Do you really want these proceedings to become public, Thomas? With everything that would be revealed about your behavior? His expression confirmed he understood the implications, the exposure of his affair, his security breaches, his attempt to extract alimony from a billionaire he hadn't known he was married to. None of it would play well for his future prospects. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to leave this building. Voluntarily and quietly. I want you to instruct your attorney to process our divorce according to the prenuptial agreement, without further delays or challenges. And I want you to cease all communication with Meridian employees about company business, effective immediately. And in return, Meridian will not pursue criminal charges for your security breaches, despite having grounds to do so. Your termination documentation will reflect only the policy violations, not the personal circumstances surrounding them, and I will not contest your claim to the property specified in the prenuptial agreement. It was a reasonable offer, even generous under the circumstances. Thomas knew it, though his pride clearly struggled with the complete capitulation required. I need time to consider, he said finally. You have until noon, I replied, standing to indicate the conversation was over. After that, we proceed with all available legal remedies, both civil and criminal. I moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to him. One more thing, Thomas. The person who helped you access the building this morning, they're being terminated as we speak. Your willingness to drag others down with you is noted, and will be considered if you choose to reject this offer. His eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected us to identify his accomplice so quickly. I'd struck a nerve, reminding him that his actions had consequences beyond his own career. Security will escort you out, I said, signaling to the officers, waiting outside. Your personal belongings will be delivered to your mother's address by courier. My mother's, he repeated, confused. I don't live with my mother. No, you live with Melissa Moore in her downtown apartment, I confirmed. But given that her employment status is currently under review, I thought it best not to make assumptions about the stability of that arrangement. It was a small twist of the knife, perhaps petty, but I allowed myself this one indulgence after months of calculated restraint. Thomas stood stiffly, his face a mask of suppressed emotion. This isn't over, Victoria. It is, Thomas, I corrected, him gently. It has been for some time. You just didn't know it yet. I left him with the security officers, walking briskly toward the executive elevator. The confrontation had taken less time than anticipated, and I needed to prepare for the executive briefing that would precede the company-wide announcement. Sarah was waiting by the elevator, her expression concerned. How did it go? About as expected, I replied. He tried several approaches, denying my identity, suggesting I was delusional, attempting reconciliation, then veiled threats about the divorce. I gave him until noon to accept our settlement terms. Will he? Yes, I said with certainty. He's a survivor, above all. Once he processes the complete collapse of his leverage, he'll take the path of least resistance. The elevator arrived and we stepped in together. Sarah consulted her tablet as we ascended. We identified his accomplice, junior HR associate named Kevin Barnes. Apparently, Thomas convinced him he'd forgotten his access card and needed to retrieve critical presentation materials for today's meeting. Terminated? Yes, with security escort. He admitted everything immediately, claimed he had no idea Thomas had been fired. I nodded, unsurprised. Thomas had always been persuasive, particularly with junior staff eager to help an executive. Your mother has arrived, Sarah added. She's waiting in your office. I felt a flutter of apprehension. My mother had always supported my career decisions, including the creation of my dual identity, but she'd never fully understood the extent of my compartmentalization. Explaining why I'd kept my true role at Meridian secret from my own husband would be a delicate conversation. The executive team is gathered in the main conference room, Sarah continued. Gregory has briefed them that you'll be making a personal appearance, but most still don't understand the full situation. And Novatech? CEO and CFO arrived 10 minutes ago. They've been advised that there's an internal announcement preceding the acquisition disclosure, but no specifics. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor, and I took a moment to center myself. The confrontation with Thomas had been draining but necessary. Now came the more complex task of reshaping Meridian's understanding of its leadership structure. Let's say. Start with my mother, I decided. Give me 15 minutes before the executive briefing. Sarah nodded and peeled away toward the conference room as I continued down the corridor to my office, a space I'd used only occasionally over the years, maintaining it primarily for the rare occasions when Victoria Chen needed to make an appearance at headquarters. Lily Chen sat with perfect posture in one of the visitor chairs, dressed impeccably in a silk ensemble that betrayed nothing of her 70 years. She rose as I entered, her expression a careful blend of concern and curiosity. "Victoria," she said simply, embracing me briefly before stepping back to study my face. "It appears the moment of truth has arrived." "Not quite how I planned it," I admitted, gesturing for her to sit again as I took the chair beside her rather than retreating behind the imposing desk. "It rarely is," she observed dryly. "Sarah provided some details, but I'd prefer to hear from you what's happened with Thomas." I gave her the condensed version. Thomas's affair with his secretary, his attempt to leverage the divorce financially, his security breaches at Meridian, and finally his discovery of my true identity. My mother listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing until I finished. Then she sighed deeply, reaching over to take my hand. "I warned you about maintaining such elaborate divisions in your life," she said, not unkindly. "Secrets require constant vigilance, and eventually, the effort exceeds the benefit." "I know," I acknowledged, "but I never expected it to unravel quite so spectacularly." "Men like Thomas can't accept defeat gracefully," she noted. "Your father dealt with many similar types, charming, ambitious, but ultimately hollow at their core. They crumble when their self-image is challenged." "He's threatening legal action," I told her, "both against Meridian for his termination and against me personally in the divorce." My mother dismissed this with a slight wave. "Empty threats from an empty man. Your attorneys will handle him." She was right, of course. Thomas's legal position was untenable, his threats born of desperation rather than strategy. "The question now," my mother continued, fixing me with her penetrating gaze, "is what kind of leader you choose to be moving forward." Victoria Chen stepping out of the shadows changes everything. For you, for Meridian, for your future. "I know," I said again, feeling the weight of that decision anew. "No more hiding, no more division, just one identity, visible and accountable." She nodded approvingly. "It's time. Your father would be proud to see you claim your place openly." A soft knock at the door signaled that my 15 minutes were up. Sarah peered in, apologetic but insistent. "The executive team is ready whenever you are." My mother stood, smoothing her already immaculate outfit. "I'll wait here until the company announcement. Some things are better handled without mothers present, even at your age." I smiled, grateful for her understanding. "We'll talk more after." "We will?" she agreed, her tone making it clear this was a promise rather than a suggestion. As I followed Sarah toward the conference room where Meridian's leadership awaited, I felt a curious lightness despite the gravity of the moment. The confrontation with Thomas had been necessary closure on a chapter of my life that had ended the moment he packed his bags to leave. Now came the beginning of something new, a unified identity, a reclaimed narrative, a future without shadows or divisions. The executive team rose as I entered the conference room, their expressions a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and in some cases, dawning recognition. Gregory Wells stood at the head of the table, visibly uncomfortable with his transitional role as the figurehead giving way to the true power. "Thank you all for your patience," I began, taking my place at the center of the table. "I know there's been considerable confusion this morning, some of which spilled into our reception area thanks to Thomas Reynolds' unscheduled appearance." Murmurs of acknowledgement rippled around the table. News of the confrontation had clearly spread. "Before we discuss the Novatech acquisition and restructuring, I need to clarify my role at Meridian Technologies, both historically and moving forward." I looked around at the assembled executives, many of whom I'd evaluated and promoted over the years, always from behind the veil of board directives and strategic guidance. Most of you know me as Victoria Reynolds, an occasional marketing consultant. Some of you learned yesterday that I am actually Victoria Chen, founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Technologies. Today, those separate identities are being permanently unified. The executives exchanged glances, processing this revelation with varying degrees of surprise. Even those who'd heard rumors after yesterday's board meeting seemed stunned to hear it confirmed so directly. I founded Meridian 12 years ago and have guided its strategy through the board and through trusted proxies like Sarah, I continued. For personal and professional reasons, I maintained a separation between my public identity and my role as founder. That separation ends today. I outlined the restructuring plan that would accompany the Novatech acquisition, including my new position as executive chairwoman working directly with Gregory as CEO. I explained the circumstances of Thomas's termination, in broad terms, emphasizing the security violations without delving into our personal relationship. The company-wide announcement will take place in 30 minutes, I concluded. I expect all of you to help manage the inevitable questions and concerns from your teams. Change creates uncertainty, and your leadership will be essential in maintaining stability and focus. As the executives filed out to prepare for the company-wide meeting, I remained behind with Sarah and Gregory, fine-tuning the announcement strategy. Thomas has gone public, Sarah reported, checking her tablet. Posted on LinkedIn about his departure from Meridian, framing it as his decision to leave due to philosophical differences with leadership. Makes no mention of you or the security breaches. I nodded, unsurprised. He's trying to control the narrative. It doesn't matter. The truth will become evident soon enough. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. Should we prepare a counterstatement? No need, I replied. Our announcement will speak for itself. Besides, publicly engaging with Thomas's version would only lend it credibility. My phone buzzed with a message from Diana. T's attorney called. They're accepting all terms. Divorce proceeds as filed with no challenges. Letter of agreement being drafted now. I showed the message to Sarah, who nodded with satisfaction. He folded faster than I expected. Reality finally sank in, I observed. Thomas always could recognize when a position was truly untenable. As we headed toward the company auditorium where employees were gathering for the announcement, I felt strangely calm. The chaos of the morning, Thomas's intrusion, the confrontation, the executive briefing, had crystallized my purpose rather than shaking it. Victoria Chen was stepping forward at last, claiming her place at the head of the company she'd built. No more shadows, no more divisions, no more hiding. And Thomas Reynolds was about to become nothing more than a footnote in that company's history. The auditorium hummed with anticipation as employees filled the seats, speculation rippling through, the crowd like wind across water. On stage, a simple podium stood before the Meridian Technologies logo, the symbol I'd designed 12 years ago when the company existed only in my business plan. From the wings, I watched Gregory Wells take the stage first, his familiar presence intended to provide continuity before the revelation that would follow. Sarah stood beside me, her tablet displaying a live feed of social media mentions of Meridian, monitoring for any external disruptions to our carefully orchestrated moment. Nothing from Thomas in the last hour, she murmured. His LinkedIn post is getting traction, but minimal engagement from industry insiders. They're waiting to hear our side. I nodded, unsurprised. The tech industry thrived on gossip but protected its own. No one wanted to align themselves with Thomas's narrative until they understood the complete picture. Your mother is seated in the front row, Sarah added. Novatech. Executives are with her. On stage, Gregory was working through the preliminary announcements, record quarterly results, upcoming product launches, standard corporate fare designed to create a foundation of stability before introducing change. As many of you have heard, he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system, today marks a significant evolution for Meridian Technologies. We're finalizing the acquisition of Novatech, expanding our capabilities in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Approving murmurs spread through the audience. The acquisition had been rumored for months, though the timing had been kept confidential. This growth opportunity coincides with another important development, Gregory continued, his eyes finding me in the wings. For the first time in Meridian's history, our founder and majority shareholder will be taking a direct, visible role in company leadership. The murmurs intensified as Gregory gestured toward the wings. Please welcome Victoria Chen. My entrance was met with polite applause tinged with confusion. Many employees recognized me immediately as Victoria Reynolds, the occasional marketing consultant, and their bewilderment was evident as they tried to reconcile this familiar face with the name they'd just heard. I took my place at the podium, scanning the sea of faces, some puzzled, some shocked, a few showing dawning comprehension. In the front row, my mother sat with perfect posture, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Thank you, Gregory, I began, my voice steady and assured. For those of you who know me as Victoria Reynolds, marketing consultant, today's announcement may come as a surprise. The truth is both simple and complex. I am Victoria Chen, founder of Meridian Technologies and the architect of its vision since inception 12 years ago. The ripple of astonishment was palpable, employees exchanging startled glances and whispered comments. I founded Meridian with a clear purpose: to develop technology that enhances human connection rather than replacing it. That vision has guided every strategic decision, every product development, every acquisition, including today's partnership with Novatech. I paused, allowing this foundation to settle before addressing the questions undoubtedly forming in their minds. You might wonder why I maintained a separate identity within my own company for so many years. The answer lies in my father's experience as a tech pioneer who lost everything when investors valued profit over innovation. I chose to build Meridian differently, guiding its growth from behind the scenes, evaluating its culture firsthand. Through my consulting role, ensuring our values remained intact as we expanded. The explanation seemed to resonate, heads nodding throughout the audience. Silicon Valley was full of cautionary tales about founders pushed aside by profit-hungry investors. My approach, while unusual, made sense within the industry's context. Today marks a new chapter for Meridian, I continued. The acquisition of Novatech creates opportunities to advance our mission in exciting ways. It also necessitates changes in our leadership structure. I outlined the reorganization briefly, emphasizing continuity in key positions while introducing the integration of Novatech's leadership into our executive team. Then I addressed the elephant in the room. Some of you may have noticed disruption in our marketing department leadership. Yesterday, Thomas Reynolds was terminated from his position as VP of Marketing due to multiple violations of company security protocols, including unauthorized access to confidential board communications. The auditorium fell silent, employees frozen as they processed this information. In the middle section, I noticed several marketing team members exchanging significant glances, pieces falling into place about their department's recent turmoil. I understand this revelation, combined with my identity disclosure, raises questions about potential conflicts of interest. To be completely transparent, Thomas Reynolds is my soon-to-be ex-husband, a personal connection that was known to the board but not disclosed company-wide to maintain appropriate boundaries. The silence deepened, hundreds of employees collectively holding their breath as they absorbed this bombshell. However, I emphasized clearly, his termination was based solely on documented security violations investigated by our IT security team and Human Resources Department, with board oversight. To ensure objectivity, The evidence was reviewed by independent counsel and found to be incontrovertible. I could practically see the gossip networks activating throughout the room, employees making connections between Thomas's departure, his affair with his secretary, and my true identity. Meridian's success has always depended on our integrity, our innovation, and our people, I continued, steering the narrative back to the company's future. Those foundations remain unchanged. What evolves today is my visible commitment to leading alongside you as we build Meridian's next chapter. I introduced the Novatech CEO, inviting her to join me on stage to formally announce our partnership. The remainder of the meeting focused on the acquisition details, integration timelines, and growth projections, solid corporate substance to balance the personal revelations. As the presentation concluded and employees filed out, many lingered, forming small clusters to process what they'd heard. I remained on stage, accepting congratulations from the Novatech executives and fielding questions from department heads who approached with a new deference in their manner. Sarah appeared at my elbow, tablet in hand. "Initial reaction is positive," she reported. "Employees seem more intrigued than concerned. The marketing team is scheduling an emergency department meeting. Apparently, they've been struggling with Thomas's leadership for months, but didn't know how to escalate their concerns. Schedule time for me to meet with them tomorrow," I decided. "They'll need reassurance and clear direction." My mother joined us, her assessment characteristically direct. "Well done. Authoritative without being defensive. Your father would have approved." Coming from her, this constituted effusive praise. I squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. "Thomas has updated his LinkedIn again," Sarah noted, scanning her tablet. "Now he's positioning himself as a strategic advisor seeking new opportunities. Still no mention of the security breaches." "He's trying to save face," my mother observed. "Men like him always do." "Let him," I replied. "Our focus is Meridian's future, not Thomas's past." We moved toward the executive floor, where the board had gathered for a post-announcement briefing. The day wasn't over yet. There were investors to reassure, press statements to finalize, transition plans to implement. Yet beneath the logistical demands, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. For 12 years, I'd lived divided, compartmentalizing my identity to protect what I'd built. That division had extended into my marriage, creating a foundation of partial truths that ultimately couldn't sustain the relationship. Now, standing in the executive elevator as it ascended toward Meridian's uppermost floors, I was fully integrated for the first time. Victoria Chen, complete and undivided, moving forward into whatever came next. 3 months passed with the relentless momentum that defines the tech industry. The Novatech acquisition proceeded smoothly, their AI expertise integrating effectively with Meridian's existing technologies. The marketing department, under interim leadership, showed marked improvement in performance metrics and staff morale. Settled into my role as executive chairwoman, working directly with the leadership team rather than through proxies. After some initial awkwardness, employees adjusted to my dual identity, eventually treating it as just another quirky founder story in an industry full of unconventional narratives. The divorce finalized without drama, Thomas having accepted the inevitable once his leverage evaporated. He'd relocated to Chicago, accepting a director-level position at a mid-sized tech firm, a significant step down from his vice presidency at Meridian, but respectable enough to maintain appearances. Melissa Moore had resigned with the modest severance package offered, the investigation having cleared her of knowingly participating in Thomas's security breaches. She'd moved back to her hometown in Oregon, her brief relationship with Thomas apparently another casualty of his spectacular fall. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office when Sarah entered, closing the door behind her, an unusual precaution that immediately caught my attention. "Thomas is back in town," she announced without preamble. I set down my tablet. "Business or personal?" "Both, apparently." He's interviewing with Westlake Systems and requested a meeting with you. Through Diana's office. Westlake was a direct competitor, smaller than Meridian but aggressive in pursuing the same markets. The timing seemed calculated rather than coincidental. What does he want? Sarah consulted her notes. According to Diana, he's seeking closure on personal matters before potentially relocating back to the area. I leaned back in my chair, considering the implications. And Westlake conveniently scheduled his interview the same week our new AI integration launches. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Their hiring manager reached out to HR for a reference check yesterday. Standard protocol, but the timing seems strategic. Indeed. What does legal say about his non-compete clause? It's enforceable for another 7 months. But Westlake could structure his role to technically comply while still extracting valuable market intelligence. I nodded, unsurprised by Thomas's maneuver. Even in defeat, he was looking for angles, for leverage, for ways to reposition himself advantageously. Decline the meeting request, I decided. If Thomas needs closure, he can communicate through Diana, and have legal send Westlake a friendly reminder about his non-compete restrictions. Sarah made a note. There's one more thing. Thomas has been meeting with Jared Patterson. That gave me pause. Patterson was a tech journalist known for investigative pieces on industry leaders, usually unflattering deep dives into corporate practices or leadership failures. Source? One of Patterson's researchers reached out to our PR team requesting verification of some background details about Meridian's founding and early funding. Nothing directly about you or Thomas, but the timing is suspicious. I considered this development carefully. Thomas wouldn't risk violating his non-disclosure agreement directly, but he could certainly paint himself as the wronged husband to a journalist looking for an angle on Meridian's reclusive founder finally stepping into the spotlight. Have legal review his settlement terms, I instructed. Remind Thomas through Diana that his confidentiality obligations extend to implications and insinuations, not just direct statements. Sarah nodded. Already in progress. Do you want to prepare a statement in case Patterson publishes something? Not yet. Let's see what angle he's pursuing first. Our response depends on whether he's writing about corporate governance, gender dynamics in tech leadership, or just mining for gossip. After Sarah left, I moved to the window wall of my office, gazing out at the city skyline. Thomas's reappearance was predictable. His type never accepted defeat gracefully, always searching for ways to reframe the narrative in their favor. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Dinner tonight? Have interesting proposal to discuss. I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Since the revelation of my full identity, my relationship with my mother had deepened. She'd become an unofficial advisor, her decades of experience as my father's business partner, providing valuable perspective as I navigated my more visible role. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, product reviews, investor calls, strategy, sessions with the integration team. I'd always been involved in these decisions, but doing so openly rather than through proxies created a different dynamic. Ideas flowed more directly, feedback loops tightened, and even disagreements became more productive when not filtered through multiple layers. As I prepared to leave for dinner with my mother, Diana called with an update. Thomas's attorney received our reminder about the confidentiality provisions, she reported. They've assured us he has no intention of violating the agreement. However, they mentioned he's considering his options regarding his right to discuss his own career experiences. Meaning he's looking for loopholes, I translated. Ways to talk about Meridian without explicitly breaking the agreement. Precisely. We're monitoring the situation, but legally our position remains strong. The settlement terms were explicit and comprehensive. And the Westlake interview? They've confirmed receipt of our non-compete reminder. Reading between the lines, they're reassessing whether hiring Thomas is worth the potential legal complications. I thanked her and ended the call, gathering my things for dinner. Thomas's persistence was irritating, but ultimately futile. Whatever narrative he hoped to construct about his departure from Meridian, the reality was documented in security logs, board minutes, and legal filings. The restaurant my mother had chosen was discreetly upscale, tucked away in a historic building downtown. She was already seated when I arrived, reviewing documents with the focused attention that had made her an invaluable partner to my father, and later, an insightful advisor to me. "Victoria," she greeted me warmly, setting aside her papers. "You look tired." "Thomas is back," I explained, taking the seat across from her. "Interviewing with Westlake, meeting with Jared Patterson, requesting closure meetings with me." She raised an eyebrow. "Predictable. Men like him can't accept irrelevance." "Exactly what I thought," I admitted, smiling at our similar assessment. "But enough about Thomas. You mentioned a proposal?" My mother signaled the waiter, waiting until our wine was poured before retrieving a folder from her sleek attaché case. "I've been approached about writing my memoirs," she said, sliding the folder toward me. "Specifically, about your father's early career, the loss of his company, and the subsequent founding of Meridian through you." I opened the folder, scanning. The proposal from a well-respected publishing house known for business biographies. They want the full story? Including the Victoria Reynolds identity? "That's what makes it marketable," she confirmed. "The daughter who learned from her father's mistakes, built a billion-dollar company in secret, and maintained a double life, including marrying a man who never knew her true identity until he betrayed her." Put that way, it did sound like a compelling narrative. "And you're considering it?" "I'm consulting you," she corrected. "This is your story as much as mine or your father's. The publisher is particularly interested in the motivation behind your compartmentalized identity, the psychology of building something enormous from the shadows." I sipped my wine, considering the implications. Thomas would feature prominently in such a narrative. "Inevitably," she acknowledged, "though we could certainly control how he's portrayed within the bounds of factual accuracy." "He'd hate that. Even more than being excluded," I noted, a small smile playing at my lips. "Having no control over his depiction in a best-selling business biography." My mother matched my expression. "I thought the same. It's why I brought it to you now, with his reappearance. Whatever narrative he's trying to construct with Patterson would be thoroughly overshadowed by an authorized account. The idea had merit." Thomas's potential maneuverings with journalists or competitors were essentially reactive, attempts to salvage his reputation from the wreckage of his own choices. A comprehensive memoir from my mother, with my cooperation, would establish the definitive account of Meridian's founding and my unconventional leadership approach. It would mean full transparency, I cautioned. About the company, about my methods, about the marriage. "Yes," she agreed, "but transparency on our terms, shaped by truth rather than Thomas's revisionist interpretation." I closed the folder, decision made. "Tell them yes, with conditions. Full editorial control, comprehensive legal review before publication, and a substantial donation of the proceeds to programs supporting women in technology." My mother nodded, satisfied. I anticipated as much. "I'll have the contracts drawn up." As we moved on to other topics, Novatech integration challenges, upcoming product launches, my mother's foundation work, I felt a sense of completion forming within me. The memoir proposal represented the final step in my evolution, from shadow founder to visible leader, embracing my complete story, publicly and permanently. Thomas's reappearance had initially felt threatening, a potential disruption to the new equilibrium I'd established. Now it seemed almost fortuitous, a reminder that controlling your narrative meant owning your complete truth, not just the parts that were comfortable or convenient. The next morning, I instructed Diana to schedule a brief meeting with Thomas, limited to 30 minutes with legal representatives present. If he wanted closure, I would provide it. On my terms, in my space, with full acknowledgement of the new reality we both inhabited. He would discover, as he should have learned months ago, that I was no longer the compartmentalized woman he thought he'd married. I was Victoria Chen, complete and integrated, stepping fully into the light I'd created. And in that light, Thomas Reynolds would finally understand how thoroughly he had underestimated the wife he left for his secretary, the woman who had built the company he was now begging to preserve his connection to, even in disgrace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.